Good to go. So this is awesome because this is totally why I love to do policy talks, and it's going to be a little bit of an interesting policy talk too. And this is what I expect for pretty much an interesting policy talk. Is like half the room is people I know, and then the other two people I don't know, which is pretty awesome. So what we're going to be talking about today is social media security policies, and it sounds really boring. And what's most annoying about this whole thing is I come from the really technical side of security, and I've just kind of found my way into the CISO-y side of security recently. And by CISO-y side, I'm mostly focusing today on really interesting lawsuits. Actually, it's where this is going to reminisce, or where it's going to present itself, actually, I should say. Now that sounds a little bit weird, but what we're going to find out is that social media security, particularly the policy area, is actually the most litigious area of security policy I've ever seen. And that might not sound that interesting, but the lawsuits that we'll be looking at are kind of cool and kind of interesting. Because they essentially say, what can we talk about on social media as employees, and who regulates that? We'll be talking a little bit more as we go forward. So before we go too far down that line, who am I and why am I speaking up here? It's always the question. My name is Chaim Sanders. That's not typically pronounced Chaim, but if you feel the urge, by all means, go ahead. I currently work at a company called ZeroFox. They do social media security stuff. I don't necessarily do that for them. I don't work on the product. I work internally on the internal security side. However, as we'll see, that's going to be important for us in terms of social media security as a whole, because obviously a social media security company cares about social media security. We would hope, although it turns out that most contractors don't tend to care about contractor security, but that's a different conversation altogether. In addition to that, I have a couple side gigs. I lecture up in Rochester, so yay, upstate New York, even though I live in Baltimore. Additionally, I donate a lot of my time to the OWASP project, so that's pretty exciting for me as well. So with any sort of policy talk that covers law in any type of regard, we need to keep into account that I'm not a lawyer as much as I would like to be, as much as I watch a crap ton of Law and Order SVU, and as much as I stayed at the Sheridan Inn last night or whatever it is, I still am not going to be a lawyer, and I'm not going to go back to school for that long. But the good thing here is that I have a lot of vested interest in social media security. And so I had a lot of time to go through this and figure out what the actual ramifications are. So, what is social media security? Before we can answer this whole policy question, we really need to understand what I'm talking about here. There's some obvious things that we can take into account. Facebook is social media. All right, everybody here agrees. Probably everybody here has Facebook. We'll talk about that in a couple seconds. LinkedIn, yeah, I think we all see that as social media. But when we start getting into some more nebulous areas that the policy that you're going to be writing or applying still probably applies to, we start talking about things like Reddit, right? There's a social construction. What about blog posts, where you're actually commenting on things? Do those apply? Does your social media policy apply? Chances are high that it does in the ramifications that are going to apply, the disciplinary actions that you're going to take, the effects that you're going to want to restrict. So when we start talking about social media policies, people get concerned that there's Facebook. I'm like, yeah, Facebook is cool, but we're also talking about a whole suite of other things that isn't just Facebook. Now, when we talk about Facebook, though, we need to realize why we actually care about this. So I'd like to give some perspective here. There are 6 million people, or phones for people, right? There's about 7 million people right now in the world. So almost, 6 out of 7 have phones. 4.5 out of those people, 4.5 billion, have toilets, all right? Almost all the same people who have toilets have email. And I guess we all know our grandparents who don't have email, so, okay? And then you gotta put this in perspective. Half the people who have toilets on the planet have Facebook. That's insane, right? That's a large attack surface. So this is why we care. When we think about phishing, we look at large attack surfaces and how likely an attacker is to try and leverage that because they know that you have it, where the threat vector actually sits. Email's pretty obvious, and we've all seen a crap ton of phishing on email, right? And by the way, if you're concerned about cursing, I apologize. I won't stop, but I apologize. So we've seen a lot of phishing via email. So Facebook also has this really clear, obvious advantage that people can target it, and that's really nice. Now the interesting thing to consider is the rest of this target graph. When we start talking about other tools, right, Google, Maps, and things like that, hundreds of millions of people use them. When we start talking about the size of the largest employer on the planet Earth, that's the DoD at 3.2 million people, that has a large attack surface that can be targeted. And then we talk about where you guys are spending your money today. right? How do you need to fix that really cool SQL injection vulnerability that's in your application? And how much money are you putting towards that? Meanwhile, how much money are you putting towards solving the attacks on email, Facebook, or I guess in this particular context, toilets, right? But the idea here is pretty simple. If you're spending, 40% of your budget on just internal tools that are only seen by 100 people, then maybe you should consider the actual ramifications of what your threats look like and where they're going to be targeting. That being said, there's also something to be said about social media at work. Now, who here is actually guilty of this? Using social media during the day at work because it's awesome. Jake, raise your hand, because I've talked to you while you're at work. Awesome.
I'm doing it right now.
I'm at work, I'm on social media, it's great. So this turns out to be about 67% of employees admit, I think this is low, but admit to regularly checking social media while at work. And I'm definitely one of those people, which is a fantastic adventure for everybody involved. Now that's a problem for you as a security person because that's why we're here. The problem is that this is our traditional perimeter security. Now we can all say like the ANYCon until we're blue in the face and there's no perimeter anymore and we're all great, but all of you pretty much have DMZs at this point still, so I'm not going to acknowledge that fact wholeheartedly. So we have defenses and we've built up this whole environment about what to do on our perimeter from an internal box to an external space. We have things like WAFs, we have SaaS tools to run honeypots. We've heard literally last talk at Tom's talk, we heard about 16 different things that people are doing. And it was fantastic. And that's amazing when you're controlling the tool. But as we move more and more into a modern architecture, we end up with something that looks like this. I can't control the security tools that are put in place in front of that application, so all I can do is I can control policy, and then I can control street smarts, right? Like don't click on this shit, and multi-factor off if maybe, right? Like maybe I'll be able to control that, but essentially I'm at the will of whatever platform is providing that service. So we can start talking about crazy things like the fact that Facebook or even WordPress, like WP Engine, don't support SAML. So that whole authentication system I built for my internal system, well, that's just not going to work. In fact, when we start talking about some social networks, they don't even support sharing the account. So I believe that Facebook Pages is this way, but don't hold me to that. Certainly one of the social networks is very heavily like this. It can only be linked to one user. And so when you start dealing with offboarding and onboarding users, you're like, hey, can you log into your personal email and transfer that company asset to somebody else? And they're like, what? And you as the security guy have to be responsible for that. All right, if I haven't demonstrated enough why you care about this, well, there's a solution, right? This is my favorite part of security, the academic solution. And I'll explain to you the academic solution very simply to you, right? Who here has ever dealt with ARP poisoning, address resolution protocol? And from the academic perspective, there is a way to 100% solve ARP poisoning, and what is that?
Statically MAC addresses?
Static domain, static ARP tables, exactly. Why would you never do that? Great question. You would never do that because as soon as you even hit 50 machines, that's untenable, right? That's crazy. Not to be confused with Tenable, which is a large organization that makes software. So the situation here is the same, right? The naive approach to dealing with social media security, block social media. Now that sounds great in principle, except the fact that everybody here who has an organization probably has some sort of presence on social media for the sales, the marketing, support, communication, whatever. Not to mention the fact that if you don't use it, there's a high chance that you may be targeted on it. So think about if an organization like Walmart didn't have social media, and then let's say somebody who didn't like Walmart just took over the page and just posted or took in support questions and answered yeah, you should probably go check out Amazon.com. It's a lot quicker and cheaper. That would not be helpful to your work. Additionally, when you start looking at the academic solution, you don't consider what I like to call the policy avoidance samurais, or employees. Now, when we start talking about this, we start needing to consider the fact that we actually do have security mechanisms in place, and part of our policy is that we want to enforce those security mechanisms. And as security practitioners, we want to know as much about our environment as possible. If we say, hey, no social media, what's not going to happen is people are going to be like, well, the policy says no social media. There's no social media allowed here. Nobody can use it. They're going to say, why don't I just use this on my phone, tether my phone, VPN into somewhere, use a hotspot, so on and so forth. Even going as far as setting up your own wireless access point. I remember I did that when I was in high school and they blocked social media. That was a great time. Just hung it out of a window with a garbage bag around it. Right? This type of thing is insane, but this is what people do to get around policies. So as soon as people start violating your policies, they start violating other policies that you have in place to benefit the organization. Your end goal is really not so much to deal with social media. Sure, you care about that. We'll talk about some of the use cases. But you care more about being able to see all traffic that's going through your network. So you know if they're exfiltrating large amount of information, maybe your malware detection goes through that, you're terminating TLS to look at sites and make sure they're not visiting porn during the day, whatever, things like that, you can imagine. So this becomes a huge problem for us when we start talking about actual employee behavior when you just try and block it. All right, so I think I've sold you on the fact, hopefully, maybe not, maybe I'm a bad salesman, you'll never buy a car from me, but I think I've sold you on the fact that maybe there's no magic bullet of just disabling social media. That's like too crazy. So how do we deal with this? Well, my offer to you is a two-pronged approach. The first, and these are the worst of the two-pronged approach if you're like a technical person. The first is that we're going to need an actual policy, and that policy is going to describe exactly what we're expecting of people to do. And then the second is training, which is going to guide employees on how to do that. It's going to hold their hands as they go through it. It's actually insane when you walk into an organization after being in technical security land for so long, and you're, the latest heartbeat bleed and SQL injection, this is so cool. And you come to the realization, like, my biggest problem as an organization is my salespeople are going to click on it. Right? That is not a realization that you have normally, and this is kind of how you realize that security awareness is one of the most important things you do. Hey, that email that came from the CEO that's asking you to transfer money, maybe just call them, maybe just ask, right? Same idea here. Maybe that MFA or that Street Smarts, that new pop-up burger in New York that says it's going to be awesome, maybe that's not legitimate. Maybe you should question it for half a second. All right. So, if we do use this, is there any advantage? Well, yes. Actually, we can not only leverage this from the sales and marketing perspective, we can leverage this from the other awesome perspectives that we can keep in mind. My brand can leverage this social media mechanism in order to encourage itself, in order to provide capabilities that it didn't have before, like leveraging any medium that you might expect. So think about something like this. Someone is like, hey, I run a soda company, and I would really, really love if they had cherry of this soda. How do they reach out to the soda company to suggest that? Well, no one knows how to send a letter today, so that's out of the question. To call someone and wait on hold to talk to customer support? No, in today's day and age, you post on Twitter, you post on Facebook, Messenger, or whatever. Hey, where's your new cherry Fanta? I really want that. I actually do think they have cherry Fanta. But in any event, you can use this in order to allow your employees to become brand ambassadors and to better represent your brand going forward. Posting openings is a very popular example of this. That makes us feel very good, but this can also be used for very bad reasons, as you might imagine. So as soon as you start providing training on how to use social media, you suddenly become liable for some of the things that might happen there. And then you actually have to kind of regulate a little bit within your internal organization what's going to go on. Generally, this is going to be taken care of by some sort of security awareness training, so you won't become legally liable for being like, hey, you must use social media, and oh, by the way, like, you just got owned on social media, how do I deal with this? But there are some other mechanisms that we'll be talking about throughout this particular talk as we go forward. Cool. So we went over this. Employees should be taught how to use social media, but they should also be taught how to use the protections that are in place. This is the big thing, right? We can't enforce people to use multi-factor authentication on things like Facebook. We can't enforce them to speak properly. Imagine if someone was like on Twitter, hey, like I'm looking for the new cherry soda that you guys are having, and the response was like, yeah, homie, we don't got that today, like what's going on? They'd be like, what? That's not a professional answer. I expected like essentially that automation music that you hear when you call up regular phones, right? People who have been taught to be like completely neutral to the entire world and have no feelings in their tone of voice at all. Drones, as a matter of speaking. And that's maybe good or bad depending on your take on culture as a whole, but that has nothing to do with what we're talking about today. You need to tell them exactly how to represent the company and how you want that to be represented. They also need to know that what they're posting on the internet can be used against them. How many of you have LinkedIn? All of you should be raising your hand. And then how many of you are obviously associated with your company, probably? That's like a really weird thing. And how many of you realize that the email that you use to register your LinkedIn is shared by default? Cool. So you should probably check that when you get home, because that is a fantastic treasure trove to get emails, which can then be used to try and log into Facebook because it's your personal email, and then all you have to do is guess a password. And by the way, if you use the recovery, then you get some information about what's going on. So there's like way too much stuff available generally, and it's like not the best idea. So things like tracking login locations, multi-factor authentication, security checkups, using a single device to access things, additional device controls that may be in place, checking for impersonators, reporting suspicious activities, avoiding fraud, right? I have a whole list here. It's not that interesting because we're here for the sexy part of this. What could go wrong, right? What could possibly go wrong when we come up with this? Well, we're going to figure out. Essentially, we have a little bit of a list here of what might go wrong and how this could hurt you. So our customers, or our employees, I should say, to our customers could make promises we can't fulfill. Suddenly, this should start sounding somewhat legal very quickly, right? They can provide our customers with the wrong answer. Hey, how much clearance does my Chevy Tahoe have? Oh, that'll be 7 feet. Oh, I'm going to go over under the 7-foot bridge, and then the roof comes off, right? Suddenly, we have a big issue here, and we need to control what's going on. Of course, then we get into the actual obvious illegal oversharing things, talking about where the organization is going to go, what things might be under investigation, what could be shared. There's all sorts of ramifications there. And obviously, sharing confidential information in any regard is always kind of cool. So, enough about the problem. How do we try and address this? And this actually becomes the really interesting part, because normally you would say, well, the addressing is easy from a policy perspective. I say they can't say certain things on social media in regards to the brand. Cool. Well, that is going to become a little bit difficult, and we're going to cover that. But let's first consider what is actually shared over social media becomes important to you. And so we need to consider what our employee is actually saying. So I know some of you are very tempted to send emails at work that are like funny and snarky. You're like, hey, these motherfuckers over there have no idea what they're doing over in sales or whatnot. Or in the case of silence, you might say something like, hey, silence personnel even confided to each other internally over email. They are fucked, by the way, in regards to OPM. This is what happens when you have informal kind of conversations over a formal mechanism that can then be subpoenaed by Congress or the Senate, depending on who you're dealing with. This is probably not an effective mechanism, and from a security policy perspective, you should frown upon this, if not try and control for it. Now that being said, you're not going to have much success according to things like this, right? Like your CEO is going to be cursing in his email, and if you're like, hey, I read your email, or am I scripted, and it like flagged on the word fuck, and like you can't do that, he's going to be like, ha. Yeah. So, okay, what can we honestly do? We can restrict them talking badly about our organization, right? That actually turns out to be not exactly true, particularly in this area. So we can restrict, and this is literally what we can restrict, people from making statements that are blatantly or maliciously false or defamatory. That is the literal exact words. And the reason why we can do this, or we can or cannot do this, depending on how you read, is due to the National Labor Relations Act. Now, some of you are probably familiar, at least in passing, with this, because many of you are familiar with the law that protects you from being able to discuss how much money you make with your coworkers. Is everyone at least somewhat aware of that? And if not, congratulations. You are legally protected, cannot be fired for telling your coworker how much money you make.
In New York?
In the United States. In the United States as a whole. The National Labor Relations Act protects that, and in New York as well, as a state in the United States, at least as far as I'm aware right now.
I'm learning so much right now.
Yeah, well, here we go. You're about to learn even more. There's this one section here that is actually worth reading, the right to self-organization. To form, join, or assist labor organizations to bargain collectively through representation of their own choosing and to engage in other concerted activities, keep in mind the concerted activities term, for the purpose of collective bargaining or other mutual aid or protections, as well as the right to refrain from any or all such activities. What does that sound like? It should sound like unions, right? Like I hear unions when I read that. Weirdly, what I hear versus what like actual legal minds hear is completely different. So the collective bargaining part, or the concerted effort for collective bargaining and mutual aid, is actually what's really going to hinder us going forward. So while private companies don't have the constitutional duty to allow, that whole free speech, that is, you can't, when you were like 4 and you walked into a room and you're like, freedom of speech, I can say whatever you want, and they're like, this is a school, shut the fuck up. That's because they're not required to actually enforce the First Amendment, well, whichever amendment, right? The entire area doesn't necessarily apply to them. However, there is litigation that's in place and the NLRB is responsible for enforcing it, that actually protects you as an employee from saying and doing certain things. So this is good news for you, bad news for you as a security person. And it's bad news for you as a security person because it essentially allows you to do these things, right? Engage in union activity, cool, we got that. That doesn't necessarily too much apply to us. Protected concerted activity, and that's what we're going to be, that's what we're going to be concerned with. Any activity is considered protected concerted activity if it's when an employee acts, quote, with or on the authority of other employees and not solely by and on behalf of the employee themselves. Well, that sounds like if I work with any other employee, then I'm pretty much covered. And we're going to see that actually come to fruition. There's a couple other things that the NLRB covers. You should definitely look into this if you're interested. Some of these are really interesting, like share information about pay, benefits, working conditions, and so on. Cool. So now we start talking about what the limits are of what we can say. And this is the actual interesting part of this talk, and why I'm actually kind of happy that like 10 people showed up. So that was pretty cool of you guys. So the first one we want to talk about is really like the first case that we have here. This is 2010, and Buffalo, right up the street, right? We're feeling good. See some Buffalo fans in the back. Right, so a worker posted on Facebook that another employee felt that her coworker did not help the employee's clients enough. And she literally asked how other coworkers felt about it, and they all responded, and there was light swearing essentially. They were like, I don't think this person does shit. You know, you can imagine what this might be. And then all four of the people who responded in the original poster were fired. Now you might say, why were they talking about work in a public medium where customers might be able to see? That seems like outside of the scope. That seems perfectly within my rights as an employer to fire them. You would be wrong. It was found that the organization unlawfully discharged the 5 employees because Facebook posts are, quote, concerted activities in this particular case, because there's more than one employee, according to Phil versus the NLRB from 1986. That didn't obviously reference Facebook, that referenced concerted activities being protected. All right, cool. So generally, Facebook is a protected activity if you do it with a bunch of employees. All right, so how far does this go? Costco had a policy prohibiting that damage the company, defame any individual, or damage the person's reputation, or violate policies outlined in the Costco employee agreement. This looks like something we would all write. I'm pretty sure most of us would write something like this. This is just too broad, right? This clearly encompasses concerted communications, particularly labor communications as you go forward. It was ruled that it was not a valid security policy, and they had to change it. It was not enforceable. Does it go further? I'm glad you asked. DirecTV, do not contact the media. I would definitely agree with that. As a security person, I'd be like, don't talk to anybody, right? Like, if you're an employee until I tell you so, you have no thoughts. Right? Okay, so we keep going. Employees may not blog, enter chat rooms, post messages, or otherwise discuss company information disclosed on public record. All right, that sounds pretty good. However, it was ruled that, of course, Section 7 encompasses these employee communications about labor disputes with newspaper reporters. This is protected concerted activity. You can't just bar everything like this as you go forward. It also doesn't describe what company information is protected here, and it could include salary information, information about working environment, things that we previously saw were protected. So in this particular case, statements of the policy are not intended to, the statements in this policy were not intended to restrict the actual Section 7 qualifications. And even if they had put the qualification there that this does not explicitly apply to Section 7 elements, this by itself does not make a legitimate policy, or I'm sorry, an illegitimate policy legitimate. So you can't just be like, hey, this is true except for all the places where it's not true. You have to be very specific about what is and is not allowed. If this sounds awful and litigious, that's because it is. And isn't it interesting? All right, so we start getting into some more like crazy areas. This is going to be like the last example, but this one's pretty fun. We have this like bar that's going on, and there we go. So Triple Play Sports Bar and Grill is a non-union bar and restaurant, and terminated 2 employees for their Facebook discussion about the company's tax withholding practices. A former employee initiated the conversation by posting on Facebook status that the organization should maybe someone should do something about Triple Play and do them a favor and buy them out so they can't even do their own tax paperwork correctly. Now I owe money. What the fuck? And then a second employee, so this is one employee first, and then a second employee followed up and said, I owe 2. such an asshole, right? Cool. Not exactly the most like clear thing. The interesting part here is what we're seeing is that there's 2 employees who are taking into account some type of labor dispute on Facebook, and as a result, this actual communication was considered protected, and they were not allowed to be fired. Now, this one went a little bit further because they fired not only those 2 people, but another person who was involved who just liked the post. It turns out that Facebook likes are concerted efforts that are protected. So you literally can't fire people for liking posts if they're other coworkers. Now, keep in mind that there's some interesting caveats here. If it was just the one person and there wasn't any communication, then that's a different thing altogether. The other thing that's interesting here is that not only employees commented, but customers commented on this. So you're thinking, wait, can't my policy say something like you can't discuss this type of stuff in the presence of customers? But you need to remember that in fact you need to be able to have labor disputes in front of customers. And in this particular case, the NLRB compared this to having a conversation between coworkers at the office place, but inside the hearing reach of customers, but outside of the normal kind of area where they would be. So if you're on the side just talking amongst yourself. All right, so what are the general guidelines? Let's go kind of move this a little bit along. No language that's disparaging, embarrassing, defamatory, unprofessional. Can't say that. You really need to be clear about what your examples are and what you're talking about, because obviously there is inappropriate language that you are allowed to use in the context of a labor dispute. You can call people a fucking asshole for not filing your taxes. It is protected. So that's not good. Do not post picture of company logos, facilities, uniforms. This is great for social engineering because this is protected. You can't actually do that. You can't restrict that because people need to hold up picket signs with your face crossed out on top of it. Do not discuss private confidential information. This sounds really bad from a security perspective, but of course it is protected. You need to be able to define what that confidential information is specifically that you're talking about. This can include wages or work information. Do not use the company's name and information in social media profile. Of course, again, this hinders information about discussing their employment situation with other coworkers. Obtain prior approval before posting something to talk to the media. We talked about why you can't say that. Report unusual and inappropriate internal social media activity. Way, way, way too broad. Just way too broad, right? Imagine what that covers. It covers almost everything. You need to be much more specific about what this means. No commenting on legal matters. Employees are engaged in legal matters all the time, and they are allowed to comment on it. Now, you need to be very clear about what they can and cannot comment on. And no participating in social media communications using company resources and or on company time. This is the best one, right? You literally cannot do that. You have to give them a mechanism to communicate amongst themselves on company time. There was one case where this person went off and communicated about it during their lunchtime, and they fired her, and they were like, of course you can't do that. And even if she didn't do it during lunch, you still can't do it. You can't fire people for communicating their information about their office place over any mechanism they choose. So, cool. Even if you wanted to do the naive approach, it's technically not allowed. All right. So, when we talk about actualities, sure, I can say this all till you're blue in the face, and what it means is that you might get sued and you may or may not lose. But in reality, if they do something egregious, like many of you remember this particular tweet that I will read out right now. Going to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS, just kidding, I'm white. Do you guys remember that? That like ridiculously insulting tweet? So she got fired for that. Interestingly enough, if you didn't realize this, she got rehired at the same firm. Not because she sued them, just because they thought that she only had one horrible racist incident, and that was something that they could look over, I guess. Crazy. But in any event, you obviously can still get fired for things like this. There are still things you can do that are like blatantly false or egregious that will get you fired on social media. So just because they can put restrictions on place doesn't mean that you can necessarily enforce those restrictions. You'll have to sue in order to get your job back in some cases. However, there are other protections that apply to social media postings. Now this is particularly interesting. Social media posts are stored. There is case precedence for them being protected under the Stored Communications Act. Now that sounds like really mundane, lawyery. What does that mean? Well, the Stored Communications Act essentially means that you're like not allowed to store other people's information. That's really what it is without consent. So in this particular case, storing people's Facebook posts, accessing them illegally and storing it, accessing their posts legally, I guess in this case, but it would be illegally, that's not allowed. Fines and real prison time can be sanctioned against this. So if someone broke into your computer and stole access to your Facebook and downloaded that and stored it, they'll be under violation of the FCA. However, this puts the employers in a really awkward situation, as you might expect. And that awkward situation is how many of you actually terminate TLS inside of your organization to look at what people are looking at. If you work at RET, the answer is yes. If you work at, well, I hope so. I hope it's most of you, honestly. I don't know how many of you know your security teams well, but like any sort of device that you're going to put in line, like your Meraki devices with IDSs, pretty much any IDS will terminate and then undo termination. They all do that. Does this mean that you can't store people's Facebook stuff? It's a great question. Generally speaking, you're allowed to kind of get away with this as the current ruling has, as long as you're not specifically pulling it out and storing it for the reason that you're looking for Facebook information. So you're allowed to like generally look at all traffic that goes through your device, however, that goes through your network. However, you can't restrict what people can talk about on your network, as we've just seen. And some of that information is protected. Can anyone think of some information that might be protected that I can generate while at work?
I should have listened to the entire question before raising my hand.
Well, yeah, just go for it.
Can you repeat the question?
Just what were you going to say?
So here's an interesting one. HIV status is protected on a state-by-state basis. We don't ordinarily think of it as like social security numbers, date of birth, and stuff. It's a sticky one.
That is an interesting one, and you're like straight on the right track, because the one thing that you got to think about is that there are some particularly protected communications, and you might have known them as doctor-patient confidentiality, right? So all of that is protected, or attorney-client privilege is protected. So the crazy thing, I have to explain this to my wonderful HR department, and I mean that in the nicest way, is like literally someone can sue a company and then talk about suing the company with their lawyer from their company email. And you're not allowed to look at that. That's protected conversation. And if you do look at that, then fruit of the poisonous tree, you have all these problems and all that goes out the window. So you have all these kind of other situations where your information that is traversing your network may become a little bit tenuous to touch going forward. So, can I restrict my employees? Yes, of course you can restrict your employees. Granted that you can't restrict their association as being policies saying, that's a little bit too broad actually. Because all private posts have to say that they're an employee. Only things that are related to being an employee can be restricted to having to put a disclosure in place. So just some interesting things to note. You can require them to put a disclosure that they are an employee of the company. However, you must restrict that to only employment conversations. It can't be unneededly burdensome as you go forward. If this sounds ridiculous, you should imagine what this policy looks like when you're done, right? Like it's essentially like, you should have a good time. Please use social media responsibly. And we'll actually show you a policy, or we'll link to a policy that does that. So there are a couple other things that we need to take into account when we start dealing with overall conversations about social media security. Generally, managers as friends becomes a sticky topic, and it becomes a particularly sticky topic because the terminology that you're allowed to use when you conduct conversations with employees is actually based on your culture. So there was a particular case where someone called, there was a status that said that the owner of a company, the company is called Pier 60, was a nasty motherfucker on Facebook without any type of consequences. And the reason why they did that is because they determined that at the company, the culture already supported people saying things like motherfucker normally, so it wasn't out of line to do that. Right? And I know most of you are thinking, that's my company right there. Right? So that's awesome. All right,
so be in some of the conferences that they have internally, we'll hear that.
There you go. So just be aware that like trying to regulate what employees are able to say is going to be very tenuous for you. It also means that once you start trying to regulate it, you have to deal with issues like harassment. So it's often recommended that managers don't become friends with subordinates, because as soon as they see something, they're therefore responsible for dealing with it in terms of the policies that you've laid out. That becomes very difficult because there's some synergistic gains from being friends with your manager. Hopefully you like your manager enough to let them see you drunk on a weekend, which is what all my Facebook photos are. But I have no idea. In general, this is frowned upon, but in actuality, this is very hard to practice. All right, cool. So we have a pretty good understanding of what we can and cannot restrict our employees to do. I can't, in good faith, leave you with a social media security talk without talking about corporate accounts, because they're important. They're important because if you're at McDonald's and you are asked to twerk for me, ma, that is just not acceptable, right? Like, you can't allow this to go forward. So how do you deal with this type of situation? Well, hopefully you're going to have some sort of disaster recovery policy, some secondary form of logging into a system that can't be easily changed. You're also going to have some monitoring that is going on about the situation. I'll leave that as an exercise for the consumer to find the possible options. There are also solutions in terms of impersonations. So you're not just restricted to people taking over your account, but pretending to be you can be equally disastrous. There are some capabilities in terms of verification, and we'll take a look at that in a couple seconds. However, you're relying on the organization, the underlying social media organization, to provide that. So people who are generally targets for this include brands, as you might expect. CEOs can be particularly troublesome because obviously there's a trust play that you can move there from a social engineering perspective. And even regular employees are fantastic to friend other employees, get additional information that might be behind that. So let's play spot the verification. I'm going to give you like 5 seconds and just yell out left or right. Which one is fake?
What?
All right, yeah. So this one on the left is fake. This one on the right, you can clearly see, is verified. Right? This is just a Pepsi logo, right? A fake page. And this is totally possible. You can do this today. I wouldn't do it with obviously a big brand like Pepsi. This is obviously a Photoshopped example. But generally speaking, this is the kind of verification that we're talking about. As a consumer, and this is a room full of security people, this wasn't immediately obvious which one was fake, right? Like, it wasn't, I mean, maybe I could have put more of a separation so it was easier for the eye, but like, still. That being said, going forward, you need to realize that these types of fake sites can be used for advertising revenue, they can be used for poisoning kind of well communications with other companies or with customers. So it can be a serious problem for your brand if you have fake organizations impersonating you. You can also use this, and this is a somewhat recent event. I guess this is a year old at this point, but I really like this. This had like 10,000 people who were attending this In-N-Out pop-up stand in New York City. This was completely fake, right? We can see all these posts that are like, this is not real and whatnot. Well, like, you can imagine how many of these. I recently saw a Rick and Morty pop-up in Washington, D.C. I'm not sure if that was real, but like, it's just fake Facebook, right? Anyone can make these, anyone can make them popular. And the more likes you get, the more kind of advertising money you can sell. You can try and get them into a place and make them pay $5 or whatever it is that people do these days. I'm not really up to date with all the cool kids. All right, so.
I got a question.
Yeah, absolutely, sir.
Did the users or the viewers get pissed off because they know how good an In-N-Out burger is and they got duped?
I'm going to admit to this one that, you see how it says interested here? This is actually from my account. I was really interested in In-N-Out being in New York and really disappointed that, and obviously my own fault, that I didn't click on NYC pop-ups and follow up on that organization to see if it's legitimately associated with In-N-Out. But people actually, the interesting way people figured this out is they hit up In-N-Out on Facebook Messenger and they're like, did you see this? And they're like, that's not associated with us. And then this became big enough that people actually started posting it.
So what was it, 86 Crosby Street, or 92 Crosby?
My guess would be that this is someone's company. Someone has like an eatery that sells like probably hamburgers or something, and they just threw on an In-N-Out hat, or they were planning to at this particular
Oh, there's
time.
no pop-ups, we'll eat it, Five Guys.
Let's
look it up.
Yeah.
There you go. You can do the research.
Yeah.
Get back to us.
I will.
So what action can you take against imposters? This becomes the interesting thing. It becomes quite tedious to try and take down posts on social media, particularly if you have a lot of them. This actually can be a little bit complicated to do also. Like in certain situations, I know that as part of the organization we have takedown services for this type of thing, and they've tried to take down a literal duplicate photo of the person who they were trying to protect. So imagine if it was this young man over here's photo on his personal profile, and then there was a fake one that had the same photo, and you were like, hey, I represent this person, take this down, and they were like, nah. Right, it's at Facebook's sole discretion what they're going to take down. Now they have guidelines and policies, just like everybody else, but they can interpret how they want to do that.
It's a mall.
It's a mall. Perfect. Get people into the mall.
Yeah, there's like Banana, Soho, Aldo, some shoe store.
And you know what there's not?
There's not In-N-Out, no.
So this is still a really painful kind of area to build takedowns in this respect. Certain social media areas are better at doing this than others, and they kind of go up and down in terms of their responsiveness, and you can imagine that them doing this on their own is actually a problem for them, like a talk in and of itself. How do I determine if an imposter is really an imposter when someone sends me a request? How do I identify people? You can also file a lawsuit. Now, what's the interesting case is there's nothing like illegal about impersonating people on Facebook. That's just not a thing right now. There's no law, even in New York State, which has crazy laws about crazy things. That's not the case. So you can file a civil lawsuit for like defamation or emotional distress, and this has been done. I would call it not very effective and probably a huge waste of your budget to do so. Keeping in mind that when you do this, you also have to abide by these particular standards that these people set out. So for instance, Twitter will inform the user that you are trying to do a takedown on them. This is true for Facebook as well. So they'll get your email address or the email address associated with the takedown. And that might be enough for some sort of retaliatory action. And of course, they will only give up information on users when there's a legal basis. So even if you're trying to get information on who this imposter might be, that might not be a capability that you're offering. All right, so we're almost kind of out of this. Generally, who's going to try and do this imposter detection? Well, this is typically going to look like people are going to manually put this in or use some sort of algorithm to generate variations of brand names, CEO names, whatever, employee names. Typically left to information security, which is great, right? Because one more thing we all needed to do. And generally, this is going to be like a human-driven element. There are some automation capabilities, but it's going to require looking at names, images, likes, statuses, whatever. You can imagine the whole gamut going forward. That's actually quite a detailed thing to really automate, so it's pretty painful. Corporate policy. Going forward, how should I try and deal with this for my own corporate accounts? Well, first, the suggestion is that you choose one application to manage your corporate account. So if you're using Twitter and you like to use the Twitter app, use the Twitter app only. If you like Hootsuite, use Hootsuite only. If you're using Facebook and you want to use the official Facebook app, use the official Facebook app. Why would I say something like that? Because that information is available in the logs about who logged in and what they logged in with. The same thing is true for where you're logging in from and the actual times that you're logging in. If you make these regular, you can do the same things that Tom was talking about in his past talk, where you actually flow these into your log aggregator and then write a rule in Splunk or Elasticsearch or whatever that takes care of this and tries to determine when this happens. Additionally, you really kind of got to be careful if you're running an organization. You can imagine if you're running, like Reading Rainbow. I don't think that show's on anymore, so this is a good example. If you were running that page, you definitely don't want someone posting about like lizard men or like screwing things, any obscenities, posting rude pictures, lewd pictures. So you need to be able to carefully take care of these, and that might be a person that you have to full-time hire or at least partially hire from the marketing department. Sounds like a lot of extra work, and you can imagine that this policy would be very difficult to employ. Additionally, obviously you want to leverage what people can and cannot post on your account. We talked about that as going forward. And we want to actually make sure that we're paying attention to how the individuals who were getting access to the accounts are going to deal with them and let them go. So a good example of what I'm talking about here is this is an actual news story. Don't fire an employee and leave them in charge of your corporate Twitter. HMV, you guys remember that record store? Yeah.
Has this happened a couple times?
This is exactly the point, right? And this is very difficult to control via your normal offboarding situation because you usually have 1 or maybe 10 employees who deal with social media, and it's not like you just revoke their AD creds and like they can't log into their own social media anymore. It's not how it works, although that would be great. Cool. So keeping that in mind, we have some good resources. This is a collection of social media policies. It's a bit outdated, but there's like hundreds of them on there. So if you're looking for examples of terminology that's probably bad, this is exactly where to go. If you want to see like an NLRB approved one, you should read the Walmart one. Now what's interesting about the Walmart one is it literally has like one line about social media, and it's like, use social media responsibly. And then that's it. And that's why it's NLRB approved. So that's like a little bit disheartening. Generally speaking, you're probably best understanding what the risks are and talking with your lawyer beforehand about what the risks might be for your social media policies, and then trying to scale them back given the information that you know about this. Trying to take into account that employees are protected in certain situations and putting that in. So being like, well, you can't make these statements except in relation to law. I should mention that that does make social media policies really awkward to read, where it's like, don't talk negatively about the company on social media, except in blah, blah, blah. And you're like, wait, what? There's an except? Oh, cool. As an employee who reads policies, like, that's amazing. But as an employer who writes policies, that's awful. So in any event, definitely take a look at the Walmart one if you're interested in what's an NLRB approved one, and take a look at these other ones for inspiration on what may or may not be valid. And with that, we're going to move on to the questions.
Is that Twitter disclaimer thing where they say, like, my tweets have nothing to do with my company matter at all?
As we just saw here, so the question, let me repeat that, is does the Twitter disclaimer that my tweets have nothing to do with the company actually valid? As we saw here, it may or may not be valid, actually, depending on what your company's requirements are. It may disassociate you from the company, it may be required by the company to say that so that you're not reflecting upon them. I've certainly seen things like that, not just on tweets, but also on talks, where people come forward and they're like, I'm not associated with my company at this point, don't hold my thoughts for them. Other questions?
Yeah. So, for the example of the horribly racist tweet, okay, let's suppose some other employee joined in and liked the horribly racist tweet, which was about the workplace environment. Does that become, I forget the term, like a concerted communication?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the first things that we saw, and I want to make sure that we have this, here we go. So no concerted protection, no legislation in the U.S. offers protections if the statements are blatantly or maliciously false or defamatory. So in this particular case, racist things are probably considered defamatory in almost every place in the country. It's up to the court to really interpret that, but I think you're probably good. So the answer is probably yes if there's no racist thing, probably no if there is a racist thing, if that makes any sense.
So you talked about what an organization can do to restrict what employees do on social media. What about former employees? Is there any way, if there's a disgruntled employee or someone who gives away secrets on Facebook, is there any way for the employer to do something about that?
So the question is, what about former employees and what can they share on Facebook? What can the employer do? This country is great for many reasons, and one of it is that we have a relationship that's very strong between contracts and your status, your legal capabilities. So in a non-lawyer way of saying this, because I'm not a lawyer again, if you make an employee sign a non-disclosure agreement after the fact, then they're still bound by that non-disclosure agreement or any other agreement that they sign to that effect after the fact. Now make sure that your agreement is legally tight, reviewed by a lawyer, blah, 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 and you're probably good to go. Now the question becomes, what happens after that NDA expires and they're just like, hey, here's all this stuff about my company I used to work at. Particularly of interest, imagine like a red teamer doing that, right? How crazy would that be? I don't actually know the answer to that right now, but that's a great question. I'll make sure to ask a real lawyer at some point.
So the question, to put a point on it, would be, do these NLRB rules affect somebody after they've been terminated?
Probably not. I mean, you certainly sue after you're terminated for wrongful termination, and the NLRB comes forward.
For conduct that happened while you're employed.
Yes,
Yeah.
but for conduct that happened after, I don't believe that the NLRB's regulations apply. But it would definitely require talking with a lawyer first before definitively saying that. Look at how I covered my ass on that one.
You make a great lawyer.
Yeah.
So do you want to, could you add any flavor to so these were all, none of these were like statutory law, they weren't criminal law, they were NLRB administrative rules and then administrative, all these cases that you referenced. Huh?
Case.
It's not case law. And then all the opinions came out of administrative court proceedings.
Yep.
So do you want to qualify how the NLRB operates that in here?
It's a little bit tricky because typically they'll make a ruling based on a lawsuit that is brought, typically a civil lawsuit of some regard, and it is generally the precedents that are built up are available online. and many of them are referenced directly
Sure.
in case law, so they become part of the precedents that are established as part of case law. However, as you are correctly pointing out, the NLRB kind of operates as this extrajudicial branch
Yeah.
that doesn't necessarily like, you don't bring like an NLRB advocate with you to court and you're like, here, tell me what you just told me. All right, judge, did you hear what he said? Like, this case is dismissed. That's not generally how it goes. That is a pretty astute point, and it's a little bit complicated to navigate that scene correctly, and that is a good kind of like asterisk to put on this.
So one thing I did kind of correlating those cases, I noticed that those were all under Obama's NLRB. And depending on how binding those decisions are, you might get very different results under Trump's NLRB.
That is possible. I'm not quite sure how politically connected the NLRB is. My understanding is actually that it's still pretty strict in terms of its interpretation of social media policies particularly, but that's not to say that it can't change based on the will of like a particular president.
Yeah, I don't know.
At this point, I doubt that there's too much care about what they're actually doing, but I'm sure there's some conversation that's happening somewhere. That's a really good point.
I know you're not a lawyer. It is what it is.
I stayed at the Holiday Inn last night.
A lot of employers, what they're doing now is having you sign an NDA on the way out. And what they're also doing is some companies are illegally tying, if it's a layoff, they're illegally tying a severance package to signing that NDA.
Yeah, there's all sorts of, so that was going to be my initial thing, is like,
Yeah.
signing a contract on the way out, why would you do that, right?
Why would you do
Like,
that? You already
never
signed
sign
it.
anything unless you have to, and when you're on the way out, they're just like, peace.
And it's always good, just as advice, is if something doesn't look right, don't sign it, take it to a labor attorney.
Yeah.
And have them approve it or disapprove it.
Always good advice to involve the lawyers, although sometimes costly. Now, it's interesting to note that like there is a technical definition of what a severance package is, and they could tie you getting additional money that's not a severance package to you signing an NDA. Now, that would have to be like a pretty good amount of money for me. That would be fantastic, right? Because I'd be like, oh, another NDA? I'll take $20,000, right? It's
Yeah,
negotiable.
$20,000.
Everything's negotiable. So that would be pretty awesome. But I haven't really seen it myself.
Because I had a friend that was laid off a couple years ago. They tied it to an NDA, a severance package. He was only there for a couple of years ago. This isn't even worth any of it. But the verbiage in the outgoing paperwork also said your severance package is tied to New York State unemployment, which is highly illegal.
Again, I'm not a labor lawyer, but yeah, I'm not quite sure about that. I tend not to get laid off that often, but I'm sure after this talk, I'll be laid off pretty quickly.
Cool.
Do you have other employees here that can chime in, so it's now a concerted communication?
Yeah, that would be awesome.
High
Right?
five to everybody.
My employer does X, Y, Z, and this person right here in the second row works with me, and they agree. Can you like my Facebook post saying that?
The only reason it's
Legally
illegal.
liking Facebook like.
The only reason that's illegal, I know you're cut for time here, was because New York State unemployment regulations say you can't receive money over a certain amount. And the money would have been a little bit over the amount, which would have put him into legal jeopardy into New York State. It was really convoluted.
Sounds very
Go to a
complicated.
labor lawyer.
Definitely worth a lawyer. Thank you to everybody who came out to a policy talk. I know this is rough. If you like policy talks, I'll be doing a GDPR talk at the Rochester Security Summit, so that sounds awful too. More than excited to see you there. It covers history, including what was the last state of the colonies that joined or ratified the Constitution. Does anyone know?
In your GDPR talk?
Yeah,
Deep cuts.
yeah, I could be. All right, well, we'll look that up. It's actually a very interesting story about the last